Okay, let's talk about our study guide real quick. So first off, the topic for our test here is biodiversity. Okay, so what is biodiversity? Basically, there's three different levels of it. There's genetic, there's species biodiversity, and then there's ecosystem biodiversity. And you got to understand all three different levels. But basically, it's a number of differences within the genetics, within the species, or within the different types of ecosystems. The specific diversity of life we have in those areas. Now, why is genetic biodiversity important? Well, if you have a monoculture of everybody who's very similar genetically, if some kind of stressor happens, if some kind of selective pressure is applied, and they go through a bottlenecking event, and this can cause extinction. And so that's the big issue. How do you increase genetic biodiversity? Well, more than anything else, it's required with having a great number of populations and preventing inbreeding. So you gotta let things spread out and adapt and evolve and change in order for that to happen. How do humans lower it intentionally and not? So we will often intentionally lower the biodiversity by creating monocultures because we really like a certain apple taste of the way it grows. So we grow all those apples with the exact same genes. That's creating a monoculture, and that's problematic. Now, how do we lower it unintentionally? Well, we lower biodiversity genetically by putting organisms through a bottlenecking event. So we take this wide range of diverse genetics in the species and we kill them all off by deforestation or mining practices or pollution. Now, what is species biodiversity? Again, it's the different types of species in an ecosystem. And think of it like a food web, right? The more different types of species you got, the more different connections you have, the stronger that ecosystem is going to be because all these different connections can support each other, right? If you only got a couple different connections holding that food web together, if you cut one, all the rest of them die. So we want to have as much species diversity as possible to have as sustainable and self-sufficient an ecosystem as we can. We measure it through two ways. We measure it the first way through, species evenness and species richness. All right, and our areas with high numbers or low numbers of species are more likely to survive a disruption. So again, if something happens to this area, the more species we have, okay, the more resilient that ecosystem will be. So the more diverse the genes, the more diverse the species, the more likely the ecosystem is to survive and life to continue. The whole point is, how do we continue life after a disruption? Habitat diversity. Again, Earth has to have a multiple series of habitats in case, let's say, the Earth freezes over. Well, if the entire Earth was a desert and everything froze over, then all creatures would die. But by having different types of ecosystems, if the Earth does freeze over, then we have creatures in the North and South Pole who can survive that, and life can continue. If we have something heat up the Earth, right, the Earth starts to grow and increase in temperature, then we have creatures along the equator who can survive that as well. So having a diverse set of ecosystems could help life continue. What's an environmental stressor? It's any kind of activity, it could be natural or human-made, that puts stress on a species or on an organism. An example of an environmental stressor would be climate change, because the environment there is stressing the organisms, and stress can lead to zones of what we call intolerance, and species start to die off in those stressful situations. A population bottleneck is, again, where you have a whole great diverse group of species, right? You have X's and O's and T's and G's and V's. Anyways, and then they go through this bottleneck, right? And only a couple of them make it through. So you go from 5 different genetic groups here to maybe just an O and a T. And so you're limiting the biodiversity here by putting it through a bottleneck. This could be something as simple as humans destroying forest. It could be a volcanic eruption. It's some kind of event that puts that very diverse species through a bottleneck that reduces their biodiversity because it killed off everything else. If a habitat is stressed or disrupted, which will be affected first, generalists or specialists? Specialists will always be affected if there's any stress or disruption in the environment, because they are best set when the ecosystem stays the same. All right? When what happens to species that require a large area to roam, like the lynx? If you disrupt that habitat, like the lynx needs to roam over all this area in order to survive. If we build a road through the middle of that, If we build a road through the middle of that, it limits its habitat and it can't find enough food because it lives in an area with very little food, so it's got to roam over a large area. And again, if there was some kind of stress in the situation, going back to here, generalists are always advantaged when things change. Specialist advantage when it stays the same. Okay, what is species richness? That's the number of species in an area. Literally just count them all up. What is species evenness? That is, let's say you have 4 different types of species, the X's, the O's, the A's, and the T's. Okay, we have a diversity of 4 here, but if we had something like this, there will be again, 4 group species richness here, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's not very even, because there's 3 O's and 3 T's. In order for it to be even, you'd have to have an even number of X's and A's, okay? And they basically measure biodiversity in the area. We want to have as many species as possible, and we want their numbers to be relatively even to guarantee its biodiversity. Okay, talking about, provisioning, regulating cultural and supporting services. These are a big deal. So, what are the 4 ecosystem services? Well, said it right here. We have provisioning, which is like food and water and all that good stuff. We have, I shouldn't say food and water, but like food and lumber. It's things that we get provisions, so things we need to build stuff, things we need to eat. Regulating, so that's regulating things like the climate, keeping things clean, okay, keeping things nice. So we have like the soil itself, right? We have it cleaning water as it goes down through into the aquifer. We have the rivers and streams, who again have bacteria who break down waste and recycle nutrients and stuff. Things regulate the climate, that's what that's about. Cultural, that's where we have our the aesthetics. Okay, so that's what we humans enjoy from going to these places. And supporting, so that's stuff like photosynthesis, stuff that supports life itself. The biogeochemical cycles, okay? All of that is through supporting. So everything kind of radiates around supporting. Supporting is the major one because that's what keeps life going. And then these are the things that we get from it. Okay, what are provisioning services? Like I said, that's the food and the lumber and stuff like that. What are regulating services? Those are, well, here's a better example here. So regulating services that provide regulation for the environment. So regulates the air quality. So that could be the number of plants that we have that breathe in toxic chemicals, take them out of the air, and allow us to have a better air quality. Regulating the climate. Again, this is creatures, because when they absorb carbon dioxide, it helps regulate the climate. Water purification through soil. Waste treatment, when waste gets in, poop gets into the water, bacteria break it down, disease and pest control. All these things are regulations. And of course here we have supporting, which is the other one people tend to struggle with. So right here, it's really about photosynthesis and the biogeochemical cycles, like nitrogen, phosphorus cycle, hydrologic cycle, carbon cycle, all that stuff. All right, and the soil formation, right? The things that support life growing and continuing. Okay. What does anthropogenic mean? That means we humans are doing it. Anthropos, human. We humans have done it. What are some examples of services disrupted by anthropogenic activities? Well, if we look over here, if humans cut down a whole bunch of trees to build a mine, right, we destroy the cultural value of that place, the aesthetics of it, right? If we humans decide, for example, to put a bunch of pollution into the air that kills off the plant species, right? Well, they can't regulate the environment anymore. They can't provide us with raw materials and food anymore. They can't support us. So these are things that we humans do by disrupting ecosystems and killing off organisms. We disrupt all of their services they provide for living things. What's the difference between economic and ecological consequences? Economic means money. Please pay attention to that. That'll be on your FRQ. It's all about the money. Okay? Economics is all about the money. Ecological is what happens to life. Okay? The ecology. What are the living consequences to living creatures? All right, versus economic consequences to human beings. So those are two different things, and we need to make sure we know the difference based off of what the question is asking us. I realize I'm talking really fast. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get this done before my planning period is done, so it is what it is. Anyways, you're doing a great job. All right, island biogeography. Pretty chill topic. Basically, it's how animals get from the mainland to the coast of an island. So let's say we got Africa over here. All right, and we have this little island over here called Madagascar. All right, how organisms get there is they're flung by the air or the wind or water, and they're carried by currents to the island. Now, when we talk about the islands that it goes to, you can have a small island that's close or a large island that's close. You can have a large island that's far or a small island that's far. And the basics are this. If you're a big island, you're going to have increasing biodiversity. And that should make sense, because if you're a bigger area and animals are just being flung at you through the air or through the water, the bigger the island is, the more animals can survive there and the more ones that can actually land on that place, so the biodiversity goes up. If you're smaller, things get flung at you, but they miss you. Maybe one hits you, but the rest miss you. Okay? And so what you want to be, if you want to have a maximum biodiversity, is you want to be really close and be really big. If you are really far away and really small, it's really, really hard for things to hit you because the wind will just blow it and it'll miss you. So this island would have very, very low biodiversity because this island right here is so small and it's so far away. Very few organisms can land on it. Therefore, very few species will be on it, and therefore it will have a low biodiversity. Island biogeography. So how does the geography affect life here on the island? And we can see it has to do with how close or how far away it is. So what's the best? Being large and being close. What's the worst? Being small and being far. Like, this is just logical ideas here. It shouldn't be too hard to realize. Would animals on islands be more likely to be specialists or generalists? So animals on islands get there because they're flung off of the mainland. So the only way to survive in a new environment that you've never been in before is to be a generalist. Specialists usually don't make it on new islands because the things they need aren't there. The specialists or survive that way. So animals on islands will become specialists over time, right? The more they live on an island and the longer they live there, the more they're going to evolve and adapt to just that environment. So they may start out as generalists, but they will evolve and become specialists over time. What will happen to those special species when an invasive species is introduced? Anytime something changes, like you add in an invasive species, the specialists are going to die off because there's a change. They struggle with change. They're not great. I mean, they're decent competitors, but they're not great at competing with something on such a large scale like an invasive species, like an R-selected creature that can just reproduce so rapidly. They'll have a tough time competing with them. All right, ecological tolerance. So basically, it's this. All right, organisms will be able to have a maximum survival rate in their zone of tolerance. All right, what they can tolerate in the ecosystem. Now, at a certain point, so at first, they're tolerating things, so the population is high. But then, let's say it gets too cold, or it gets too hot, all right? Or there's too much oxygen, or too little oxygen, right? Whatever it happens to be, at a certain point, the numbers will start to go down because there's too much of that thing. At a certain point, numbers will start to go down because there's too little of that thing. These are called the zones of intolerance, and you can see that there when the creatures start to die off. Okay, we have stressful zones. We have where the animals are starting to die, and then we have zones of intolerance where nothing can live or survive. So what is ecological tolerance? Basically just how much can these creatures stand some changing factor, whether that's temperature, oxygen, carbon dioxide. How can they deal and how can they tolerate that? The zone of tolerance is the area where most creatures can live with whatever that factor happens to be. Okay? The zone of intolerance is when they can no longer stand that stress because it's either too much or too little. What kind of factors might species be intolerant of? Like I said, temperature, oxygen, salinity. There's honestly pollution, right? There's any number of things that can cause problems. Is it more likely too much or too little something exceeds a species zone of tolerance? And the answer is it's both. Usually you can have too much of it and too little of it. Like water, I can drink too much water and actually pee out all of my ions and then my muscles don't work. I can drink too little water and not have enough for mitosis and my cells die, right? So too much and too little of something is bad. All right, talking about natural disruptions to ecosystems. We have tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, comets, meteor strikes, locust swarms, all these kinds of things. In terms of eras or time, what does periodic mean? I tell you, periodic means like periodical, like newspaper. It comes out every day. It's periodical. All right, every day or every Sunday paper. It's periodic. You know what's going to happen every year on this time. Some things can be episodic. So that's like, I think the Star Wars episodes. So the Star Wars episodes first came out in like 78, like the 1980s or whatever, and then the next group came out in the 2000s, and then there was a group in like the 2010s. Like, they're not perfectly spread out. They're like weirdly spread out, so they are episodic. In other words, they do happen often, but not in a regular time period, like periodic. But we do know they're going to happen, and they're going to occur repeatedly. That's what episodic means, just not in a predictable pattern necessarily. What does random mean? Well, that means it's completely random. You have no way of predicting what's going on, no guarantee this thing's going to happen, it just might. It's random. Why are sea levels rising? Because of global warming and climate change. Does the level normally stay the same? The answer to that is no. It normally goes up and down. But the problem is right now, it's going up too fast, and way faster than it's supposed to be at this time. What would what would volcanic eruption mean for an area? If there's a volcanic eruption, then you're going to have all this magma cover the land, right? And I should say lava. Magma's in the ground. So all this lava cover the land. That lava is going to cool down, and when it cools down enough, it's going to turn into rock. And that rock is going to have tons of good nutrients in it. It's going to have tons of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. So once your pioneer species land and start to break down that rock and convert some of its biogeochemical cycles and convert some of the nitrogen and phosphorus into soil, once they do that, then you'll have what we call primary succession. So volcanic eruption can actually destroy an area, but it can also provide the building blocks to regrow it at a greater level. Why do species migrate? Not what. Well, why they migrate is that the stress in an area is too much. There's not enough food, there's not enough water, it's too hot, it's too cold. The only thing that group can do is to move somewhere else. That's why species migrate. Do all species die when something bad happens? No. What else might happen? Well, obviously they can survive, they can adapt, they can evolve. Those things happen. So just because a lot of creatures die doesn't mean all life will. Life can continue, it just has to adapt to its new area. All right, so real quickly, what's the difference between primary and secondary succession? Primary, no soil, it's rock. All right, secondary, there is soil there already. So let's say for primary, that'd be your volcanic eruption, right? Completely covered in rock, or someone laid down cement on a parking lot area. That's primary succession. Secondary succession would be like deforestation. There's already soil there, we just cut down all the trees, so now that the climax community's gone, we got to restart from scratch. That's secondary succession. Can you name some? I think we talked about that. How do they create soil? Okay, in primary succession, how do we create soil? First, the pioneer species have to land. When pioneer species land, we're talking about moss, we're talking about lichen. When they land there, they're like excreting acids out of their bodies. So the acid hits the rock, breaks the rock down, and then the fungus, or the lichen I should say, or the moss will soak up all those nutrients and use it to live and grow. Eventually the moss is going to die, the lichen's going to die, and when it does, the broken pieces of rock, the sediment, mixes with the decaying matter from the moss or the lichen and creates soil. And so that happens over and over again until the level of soil starts to build up higher and higher and higher. And then you have bigger and bigger plants that come in over time. So that's an example of primary succession, where you start from rock, pioneer species break it all down into soil, you have your annuals, your grasses start to land there, your flowering plants, and bushes and trees on from there. So secondary succession would be when, again, humans, let's say, deforested an area. They cut all the trees down for lumber and left nothing but soil behind. And then that soil would already have been formed. So that's what secondary succession is. The soil already exists. With primary succession, you're starting with rock. Those are the distinctions. A keystone species is the one that all the others depend on. Remember, on an arch, the keystone is the one that holds the two sides together. If you pull this out, right, everything collapses. That's what a keystone species is. And usually they're the apex predator. They're the thing at the very, very top. But there are other creatures that can be keystone species, like beavers, for example, right? There are lots of things that are very important to an ecosystem. But for the most part, it's usually the apex predator. What is a trophic cascade? So that is a series of like dominoes essentially. So you can imagine, if not dominoes, you can imagine like a, when someone tries to build like a card castle, made all these little cards, right? And they're all sitting on top of each other, right? Layer by layer, right? You pull one of these things out and like the whole thing like collapses down. That's a trophic cascade. If you had a trophic pyramid of creatures, you had your producers, your primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then you removed a layer, like all the other ones would collapse and fall down because of it. That's a trophic cascade, when that ecosystem basically dies. Okay, let me see here. What is an indicator species? Can you name any? So if we go to a river or a creek and we look inside that river, right, and we see mayfly larvae, dragonfly larvae, we see larvae of these really important ecosystem predators, like we see those kinds of things there, we know that that's a healthy stream or river. It indicates the quality, right? If we go and look at a river or stream and there's like nothing, there's no life, we know that that's still a pollution. That indicates it's a bad environment. Or let's say we find lots of worms maybe, okay? And again, lots of worms means lots of decay, means there's not a lot of stuff living there, okay? So these are all indicators of the quality of an environment. That's what indicator species do. What will succession do to biomass? So remember, over time, we start from rock, right? And we work our way all the way down to trees, deciduous trees. So the amount of biomass will steadily go up because there's no biomass, and the trees are huge with lots of mass, okay? So biomass will go up, species richness will go up too. There'll be many different types of creatures and species that live through that time. And primary productivity, basically how much photosynthesis is being done. That also goes up because trees do way more photosynthesis than a simple piece of grass, okay? Let me see. All right, moving on down. What's better for a specialist? Environments that change or environments that stay the same? Specialists like it to stay the same. So why is climate change causing so many extinctions? Well, if specialists like it to stay the same and the climate is changing, then lots of species are going to die because they're specialists. You're changing their environment. They cannot handle that. There's a lot of stuff in this unit. All right, what does the K and K selected species mean? That's carrying capacity. What is carrying capacity? That is the level at which a population cannot surpass the carrying capacity. It hits. If it goes above it, it dies off and goes back down. You can either hang with that carrying capacity, or you can go above it and die, and above it and die, like R selected species. But K selected just means it stays near the carrying capacity. What benefit does it gain? Well, if you hug the carrying capacity line, if you're K selected species, you should look something like this. Your species goes up, and then it kind of hangs around that. It means that you're not going to have a huge jump in species, and therefore not going to have a huge die-off in your species. You're going to kind of stay nice and level. Characteristics of K-selected species are that they have very few offspring. The offspring take a lot of time to mature. They have to learn from their parents, right? They grow to be very big. They're very slow growers. These are K-selected things and K-selected issues. What is the R in R selected species? Well, the R in R selected stands for growth rate. So these kind of creatures, right, have a lot real fast, and then they die off, and they go up real fast, and they die off. They go these up and down waves over time. That's what growth rate is, basically how many offspring they can have. Now the benefit from this is that they can colonize an area quickly and take over. So it's really great for generalist and invasive species. It really helps them survive when others would not. Characteristics, again, they have lots of offspring. They spend no time taking care of them. They just throw them out there and hope some survive. Our selected species also mature very young, so it doesn't take them long to be able to reproduce. Next up, what is biotic potential? Biotic potential is basically when the species can reproduce with almost nothing stopping them. And that essentially looks like an exponential graph. Okay? All right. And that should have an apostrophe. Moving on down. Are all species either K or R selected? No, they can be kind of in between, right? They can have different levels there. Is K or R going to be more affected by an invasive species? Okay. Anyways, K-selected species will be more affected because invasive species can kind of take over the area and out-reproduce them and out-compete them really quickly. Are invasive species more likely to be K or R? They're going to be R selected. And why? Well, if they're R selected, they can take over. And that's the definition of an invasive species, is it can take over. They reproduce a lot, and they eat a lot of different things. All right, getting there. What are invasive species? They're creatures that come from one area to another, and they typically are brought there by humans. That's how they get around. But the wind and water can also carry them there. Characteristics, they are typically generalists and are selected. That enables them to survive in new environments. Okay, again, read through those standards because that's important. What does extinct mean? It means they are all gone. Endangered means they're close to being all gone. And threatened means we're worried about them, that they could go to endangered level next. So the amount of concern we have goes up like this. They're threatened or endangered or extinct. What factors can lead to a species being threatened with extinction? Well, humans can start to deforest and cause destruction of their habitat, and that can kill off a number of their species. Will all species face extinction when something bad happens? The answer to that is no, not all, okay? Because there are so many different types of creatures living in an area, the species biodiversity is going to help that environment survive, or at least something in that environment survive. A selective pressure is something that's causing everything to die in an area. Okay, that can be a selective pressure can be increase in temperatures from global warming. The selective pressure can be humans killing off every single creature that has a horn. Okay, because we want to sell it for ivory or make fancy potions with it. Those are selective pressures. Okay, and they kill things off and they cause evolution or they cause extinction. Only those two possible options here. How can we protect endangered and threatened species? Well, we got the Endangered Species Act, we've got CITES as well. Both of these enact laws, right, that restrict how much hunting can be done. We have laws that protect and preserve certain areas of habitat so that these creatures can have somewhere to live and thrive. All right, what is HIPCO and what does it mean? H stands for habitat, I stands for invasive species, P stands for population, P stands for pollution. We got C, which stands for climate change, and we have O, which stands for overexploitation or overpopulation. I think it's overexploitation, but I can't remember. Either way, it's about the same thing. What is it for? It's used to describe a way that we as humans can cause extinction. We can destroy their habitat, right? We can bring in invasive species, we can pollute, we can overpopulate, that we can cause climate change, and we can overexploit. We basically harvest too many of those things at once, okay? What is habitat fragmentation and what causes it? Well, we humans have, let's say we have this nice, wonderful ecosystem with lots of creatures living here peacefully and whatnot, and then we decide to build a road through it. This will fragment the habitat and basically cut it in half. And when you do that, you basically create, instead of having one species, you're going to over time create two species, because these two will reproduce on their own separately long enough because they can't connect with each other anymore. This causes a bottlenecking event. So in other words, the species diversity has been decreased because there's less genetic diversity, because only these ones reproduce with these ones now, and only these ones reproduce with these ones. They're not all one multi-breeding group. Okay. The big thing with habitat fragmentation is remembering the edge effect. Basically what we want is we want an area with less edge. So this is way better than this, okay? Because here we have lots of edges. The same overall area, but lots more edges. That means lots of areas for creatures to die. They tend to die around the edge. So we want less edge if possible, more connections between things. How can climate change cause habitat loss? By temperature. If we increase the temperature, right, that can interfere with roots. Roots don't like extremely high temperatures, and so the plants will start to die off. If there's too little precipitation or too much precipitation, you can drown things, you can dehydrate things, all those are problems. Sea level rise will completely, again, kill off anything that's smothered. So the sea level comes up, it kills off all the grasses in the area or the trees. That's causing, again, destruction of habitat. Why can domestication be problematic for a species? When we domesticated cattle or chickens, we made them all the same because they taste delicious, or we want them to make lots of milk. And we do that, we make a monoculture. And monocultures lack biodiversity and are easy to die off. Habitat corridors, what are they for? Well, let's say that we got this nice, beautiful forest and we want to build a little pathway through it. We can build a habitat corridor. That basically means a bridge with trees and stuff on it, right? They allow animals to pass from A to B and from B to A, so that they can continue to reproduce. So that they stay, instead of 2 species, they will stay 1 species, okay? Because they're still continuing to spread their genetic diversity around and share it with each other on both sides of the road. What are they going to do for an ecosystem? Again, maintain genetic diversity. What is the whole goal of environmental science? The whole goal of environmental science is to increase biodiversity. And I hope that you remember that. Don't forget it. All right.